Hello, everyone. Good evening here in London. Welcome to colleagues online. It's fabulous to have so many people with us to talk about the fallout from Venezuela, rewriting the UN's rules to meet the moment. And boy, is there a moment to meet. I'm Sara Pantuliano, the Chief Executive here at ODI Global. Well, if 2025 felt turbulent, 2026 is proving worse, perhaps. Well, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine to Israel's violence in Gaza, the US intervention in Venezuela, and of course, the Greenland saga, not to mention the creation of the Board of Peace, we're really witnessing a convergence, a rapid convergence towards a world that is shaped by spheres of influence, where power overrides rules, norms are treated as optional, and international restraint is steadily eroding. But I think taken together, these moves point to something that is larger than any single crisis. For me, they really suggest an unapologetic return to power politics. And I think this return to might makes right comes at a really symbolic moment. Just last Saturday here in London, we celebrated the 80th anniversary of the UN General Assembly that convened in London itself 80 years ago. There were 51 founding states that gathered to reaffirm the commitment to the UN Charter. For those who attended the celebrations, it was a very special moment that the UN Associations of the UK organized here in London. 80 years on, the UN has 193 member states, but that funding architecture remains really ill-equipped to deal with the realities of today. And it's not just conflict, but think about climate change, think about the technological advancement, the AI revolution that really requires global governance that is not there. And I think the recent crisis really exposed the limitations of the organization in safeguarding peace and security in particular, especially now that we may have a potentially alternative body. We'll talk about it in the course of the conversation this evening. And so as the post-war international order gives way to increasing disorder, we're hearing a lot of calls to rethink global governance, to strengthen the effectiveness of the UN, and really to address what is an enduring crisis of representation and legitimacy that the UN has. And that's why we've convened this conversation tonight, because it's really imperative to discuss how meaningful reform can be achieved. We've been talking about UN reform for a very long time, but we've often just focused on technocratic rearrangements rather than a deeper, more critical reform. And it's particularly important to have this conversation here, given that the UK is a founding member of the UN and a permanent member of the Security Council. And I have an outstanding panel to discuss all of this tonight and get the conversation going. To my left, Ambassador Antonio Patriotto, a regular feature here to the Global. We love having Ambassador Patriotto. Ambassador Patriotto is the ambassador of Brazil to the United Kingdom, former foreign minister. He's had plenty of senior diplomatic roles, but very importantly, he's also been the permanent representative of Brazil to the UN. And in that capacity, he has chaired the 60th and the 61st sessions of the Commission on the Status of Women, and of course, he's been the chair of the Peace Building Commission, something that is very dear to my heart. Next to Ambassador Patriotto is Hiba Ali, another dear friend and colleague of ODI. Hiba is a journalist by training. She's done loads of reporting from conflict areas, but importantly went on to help transition the UN news service called IRIN to become the new humanitarian. And she facilitates ODI Global's donors in the Post-Aid World Dialogue Series, and currently is the director of Article 109, a coalition that is working towards the renewal of the UN Charter. We'll hear a lot more about this tonight. Welcome, Hiba. And last but not least, Matthew Rycroft, Sir Matthew Rycroft, I should say. Welcome return to ODI as well. Matthew, I'm sure we'll all remember, was the last permanent secretary of DFID, and of course permanent secretary of the Home Office, but also the UK permanent representative to the UN, overlapped for a bit with Ambassador Paciota. So thank you very much to the three of you for being here. For those of you who have in a sort of an eagle eye, you will have noticed that we were supposed to also have a representative of the UK government, but it's been difficult to secure someone that was happy to, I suppose, share a line tonight. So we'll try and guess what they may have said in the conversation. But let's get started, and let's start by making the case for change. Ambassador Paciota, I'll start with you. I mean, as I said at the beginning, Ukraine, Gaza, Venezuela, now Greenland really are signaling a return to a world where force, where leverage, spheres of influence matter more than rules, institutions, and international law. So we're seeing really, to me, the crumbling of the institutional architecture that was carefully constructed and negotiated after the Second World War. So how should we respond when the very machinery that was designed to manage great power behavior, the Security Council, the wider peace architecture, appears unable to act? Is continuing as we are still viable?
Well, thank you for the invitation. I think I'm going to become a permanent member of ODI before Brazil becomes a permanent member of the Security Council. And so happy to be with Heba and Matthew, dear friends. If you allow me, I will question a little bit the language and the presentation that you made in asking my question. I don't think it's absolutely correct to say the return of the use of force or the return of might makes right. True. First of all, might doesn't make right. This is just a ready-made expression. Might making right is highly questionable, and international law is still in force. I mean, no country, as much as we have seen many violators of international law in very flagrant ways, but and we have seen withdrawal from multilateralism, but no one has withdrawn from the UN Charter. So the laws continue to apply. Sometimes I use the metaphor of laws of transit. It's not because many cars don't respect red lights that red lights don't exist or should be discontinued. The law exists. And I would point out something else that's very meaningful about the system is the supervision that the International Court of Justice, the role that the ICJ can play as an enforcer. Of course, we don't have a supra-governmental structure as we would in a domestic context to ensure that violators pay a price. But you do have political pressure, and you do have mechanisms like the ICJ. It's no wonder that some of the violators try to delegitimize as much as they can the ICJ and the International Criminal Court, because it retains a very strong moral and political strength. So that's my little take on might takes right. The other one is on we are in a world of spheres of influence. I find that also highly questionable. I tend to believe that one of the more interesting and unique characteristics of the world we are in today is precisely the trans-regional context that modern technology and trade flows, investment flows, the whole globalization era that is now perhaps entering a different phase of less intense, but it allowed, for example, for China to be the #1 trading partner for Brazil. There is no country further away geographically from Brazil than China. It's in the antipodes. And yet it is by far, it has been for more than 10 years, the #1 trading partner for Brazil and for most South American countries. So when I read about the re-edition of Monroe Doctrine and such ideas, they're very romantic and far-fetched and outdated. I was mentioning today to another audience, if President Monroe resuscitated and participated here in this audience, he would be very surprised to discover that, for example, Brazil has 140 embassies, 40 embassies in Africa, very intense relations through the BRICS grouping, and attends annual in his mind, the Americas should all be coordinating among themselves. There was no question in the 19th century of Brazil having such close relations with India, South Africa, the Middle East, etc. So it's a completely different world. Another feature of the current world is the existence of international law. In the 1820s, when Monroe created his doctrine, I have difficulty even calling it a doctrine. I think it's more like a policy. But there was no United Nations Charter. So there was no means, there was no International Court of Justice. There were no means for countries to accuse others of violating international law and to denounce this policy as not in conformity with the freely entered into agreements. So it's such a different environment that I think we really have to place this into context. And I would add something an idea that I picked up from an article that I read in the Financial Times by a very creative journalist with whom I don't necessarily agree all the time, Janan Ganesh, because I think he really put his finger on something when he said that Samuel Huntington got it wrong. Rather than a clash of civilizations, what we observe today is clashes within or fault lines within civilizations. So you have, for example, within the West, a multilateralist West, a unilateralist West. And you have affinities beyond civilizational lines. I was indicating the other day that in many respects, Brazil today has more of a worldview affinity with South Africa than with some countries, some neighboring countries, which explains why we are supporting, for example, South Africa's motion in the ICJ regarding the Israeli behavior in Palestine. So these are more indicative of today's world. Spheres of influence, I think, is a dream, a Midsummer Night's Dream. The self-appointed regional hegemons, what they encourage actually by treating the neighborhood without respect, with hostility, without respect for their territorial integrity and sovereignty, they're indirectly encouraging the region to seek for support elsewhere. And this is what you see, for example, why do the Baltic states rely so much on NATO? Because they are wary of being part of a sphere of influence, or even South Korea, for example, et cetera. So the same phenomenon can become more indicative of today's world than a return to spheres of influence. But just to conclude and be very interested in hearing the colleagues, I think what is very fundamental for the great majority, not only of governments, but of civil society representatives across the world, particularly in democracies, to uphold the rule of law. The rule of law, the very simple idea, nobody is above the law. This is what applies domestically, it should apply internationally. And a second characteristic that I think is fundamental is having representative bodies that deliberate about issues of common interest. So one of the reasons why there's so much emphasis by my country and others in Security Council reform is that it has become less than representative of today's world. There are no permanent members from Africa, from Latin America. The Global South should be better represented. There perhaps over-representation from NATO and from the West. There has been a consensus since the 1990s that it needs reform. So it's not something entirely new. But beyond that, I think we really need to look at other areas like climate. There's nothing in the UN Charter regarding our collective responsibility towards the planet and in terms of preserving ecosystems and livelihood for humankind and combating climate change and global warming. So these are some of the key areas. I think there's much more that could be said about specifics, like so much criticism of the Security Council because it's frequently blocked by the permanent members. Well, there's an article in the UN Charter 27.3 that actually has never been put into force. So just enforcing the Charter the way it has been drafted would be progress. 27.3 determines that if you are party to a dispute, you should not be participating in a vote or in a debate. And if that were applicable, it would be much easier to deliberate around Ukraine or Gaza or other topics. So just some initial thoughts.
Excellent. And you're right, multilateralism actually is continuing to work, even though, of course, what we hear, publicly makes us question that. I mean, in December, what many probably didn't realize was that the work on the reform of the peace-building architecture was actually concluded with a resolution that was passed by consensus. I mean, I'm still...
You know another example I give that has to do with this country? The sovereignty of Mauritius over the Chagos archipelago. I mean, it's a demonstration of multilateralism working slowly and at some pain, but the General Assembly requesting a view from the ICJ pronouncing itself, and ultimately the British government complying.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the PBAR, as it's called, the reform of the peace-building architecture, I think nobody really believed it could be, concluded by consensus, but it did, and it presents a strengthening of the peace-building commission that is all to be designed, but it's an interesting development. But you trying to go much further than what the resolution on the PBAR does, or what a lot of the reforms of the UN so far have put on the table. What is Article 109 try to do, and why is it different from all the reform efforts we've had in the past?
I have to say, usually the ambassador and I agree on many things, but I disagree that this is not a fundamentally different moment. I think we...
I didn't say that, by the way.
Okay, well then I'm encouraged. I think we are in a very different moment now, and in particular that we are seeing the breakdown of a respect for a rules-based order that has, as you said, Sarah, at the beginning, been the dominant approach to our international relations since 1945. I think that world order is crumbling, and so we are in a moment now where I would say akin to 1945, where we need to reimagine what a new world order should look like. I think multilateralism has had successes, but if we ask what has the UN's fundamental role been, if we compare to moments in history in the 60s and 70s when the UN did broker major peace, did prevent nuclear war, was a relevant player in the big issues of the day, that is not what we're seeing today. In Ukraine, in Gaza, in Venezuela, in Greenland, the UN is not the place people are turning to resolve those challenges. And I think if the UN cannot play a role in brokering peace and security in that way, then we should be asking ourselves, what is it for? I think the Board of Peace that Trump has created is a symptom of that problem that we're trying to address, and he is justifying his actions and saying the UN is so ineffective that I need to take matters into my own hands. So in that sense, I think we're in a very different place. You can argue it's been, on the decline for some time. So what do we do about this complete breakdown of the global security system? I think we need to think of UN reform in a much more radical way than we have seen to date. And in particular, yes, I'm referring to the Secretary General's UN80 initiative, which I think is really not at the scale. You talked about technocratic fixes. What we need now is to elevate the conversation and say, what is the new global social contract that we need for the 21st century? And I'm afraid that if we do not take radical action to revitalize the UN, we will see its total collapse. And as you said, Trump's Board of Peace is essentially positioning itself as a replacement for the UN, and if world leaders legitimize it by joining its board, they are accepting that we can take the role that the UN used to play in peace and security and put it in the hands of a private individual with a $1 billion membership fee and a chairman who has appointed himself for life, which I think is a very dangerous proposition. So to meet the moment, we need something at that level of ambition in what we put on the table. What is Article 109? It is built into the UN Charter itself, which I think is one of its strengths. We're not talking about something that comes from the outside, but actually something that was intended by the founders of the UN Charter from the very beginning. It is a clause that allows for a revision and an update to the founding document of our international relations, because from the very beginning the founders knew that world conditions would change and that this document should evolve so that it can continue to be fit for purpose over time. And so it allows for a review conference to be held. with a vote of a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly and any 9 of 15 Security Council members, meaning that the permanent 5 members of the Security Council cannot veto the process of holding a review. It gets a bit more complicated down the line, but for step 1, I think it's one of the rare mechanisms within the UN that is not subject to veto. What could a review deliver? I think, Ambassador, you've already mentioned a few of the options. Fundamentally, we would see this as an opportunity to empower the UN to actually deliver on its core mandate of maintaining peace and security. That can look like quite a number of things, and it will be up to member states to negotiate the outcomes, but it could be limits on the use and scope of the veto. It could be changes to the composition of the Security Council. But it's also much broader than that in, as you said, revisiting our overall governance structures today. The word environment does not appear in the UN Charter. You mentioned how do we govern AI and digital. The membership of the United Nations has almost quadrupled since 1945. There were 50 countries present when the Charter was signed. Most of Africa was still colonized. So we're in a very different world today, and most of the countries in the world have not had a say in shaping the rules of the game. So there's a big part of this that is about, as you said, creating more buy-in and legitimacy for the institution. What makes this different, I think, is that it is a level of ambition that goes much further. And actually, just today, Gordon Brown published a piece in The Guardian talking about the need for a coalition of countries to come together and agree a vision for what he labels a charter. He's not talking about the UN Charter, but a vision for a new international framework should look like. I think that's the level of ambition we need to be aiming for. And if such a coalition does come to be, it will eventually need a process through which, to whatever it lands on, to end up in a forum that has the universal legitimacy of the United Nations. Second, I think we're talking about a much more inclusive approach to UN reform. UNAIDS, I have heard described as a donors club, where many countries felt left out of the discussions. G7, G20, BRICS, these are all exclusive fora that don't provide a forum for everyone. And the reality is that, as I say, the world order is crumbling. A new one is being built de facto by the powers that be. And what this process allows is, rather than Trump on one hand creating the Board of Peace and China creating a global governance initiative, which it has, and Macron now saying he's going to prioritize global governance of the G7 presidency that he's hosting, that we do so, we try to build this new world order in a structured and inclusive process where everyone has a seat at the table. And then third, I'd say the fact that it is a structured process allows it to be something of a counterweight to the chaos we're seeing here, where we're reacting to what others are doing rather than being intentional in saying we're going to make a plan for building towards the future. Now, there are a number of challenges and concerns, and we can get into that, but that's the general gist of it.
Very briefly, what kind of reactions are you getting from diplomats? In particular, civil society is supportive, but what do diplomats think?
It depends on who, as you might imagine, but much more, I'd say over the course of a year and a half, we have seen a big movement from where we started, where there was more caution and trepidation about reopening such an important document, to today, where we have, first of all, several countries who have formally endorsed the idea, including President Lula of Brazil, including South Africa, so emerging powers that feel that they're not adequately represented in the system, but also smaller countries who feel the system isn't serving them, from the Gambia to Kazakhstan. And we are now having conversations with many other diplomats, and particularly seeing interest from the Caribbean, from Africa, from the vast majority of the membership that wasn't at the table in 1945 and feels that they haven't had a say, as I said, in shaping the game. Some diplomats are concerned. I would say that concern is decreasing by the day, because as one European diplomat told us, yes, we stand a lot to lose, but we stand to lose a lot, but we are losing it already. And actually what we stand to lose is being devalued every day. And so I think in light of recent developments, and in particular, most recently, the threats of annexation of Greenland, the calculus of risk is very different, where now they see that the risk of the status quo is probably worst case scenario, and anything else that we can put on the table is a step forward.
Thanks. Matthew, let me come to you. The UK has always been a very strong advocate for multilateralism, for cooperation. There's been a recent report of the Foreign Affairs Committee that was titled "The Right to Protect: Britain's Pen on the World Stage," and he actually pointed to the duty that the UK has to protect multilateralism. There is an interesting quote that the UK should help to preserve the system and lead the vital continuation of the United Nations during a time marked by extensive change and turbulence. What role do you think the UK should play at this critical moment?
Well, thank you, Sarah, for having me, and great to be on this illustrious panel. As you said at the beginning, I don't work for the British government anymore, so I just speak for myself, which is altogether easier and less stressful than representing a government. And before answering that question, I should just say that the geopolitics is clearly creating a lot of anxiety at the moment, but it's not just the geopolitics. The pace of change of technology and the pace of change of the planet are, I would say, equally as big, probably bigger than the geopolitics. And in decades' time, we will be grappling with the technology and the planet, and probably the issues that we're talking about today will have resolved themselves one way or another. But let's put all that aside and dive in onto the geopolitics. And the heading of this session is the fallout from Venezuela. But I mean, no one's even talking about Venezuela because we've had then the fallout from Iran and the fallout from Greenland and the fallout from...
That was the topic of the day when we organised
2 days ago, exactly, yeah. And that itself is a sign of a collapse, I think, of a current world order. So to get to your question about the UK, I mean, to start with the blindingly obvious, the UK was one of the huge beneficiaries of the current world order because it was one of the victors of the Second World War, and it was the victors who wrote the rules for the next phase. That's what victors tend to do. And the US as well is a very significant beneficiary of the current system. And it's worth remembering that the single biggest difference between the United Nations and its predecessor, the League of Nations, is the permanent members with vetoes on the Security Council. And the League of Nations didn't work because it didn't have enough extra clout for the countries with extra importance. So if I could challenge just one thing that you said, Heather, I think having exclusive fora is not a bad thing at all. I think it's absolutely inevitable. I think there must be groupings where the most important countries in the world, whether it's for politics or economics or peace building or anything else, do come together and do have more responsibility and therefore more clout within the organizations than other countries. You can't have everyone coming to everything. You have perfect representativeness then, perfect legitimacy, but absolutely imperfect effectiveness. And every organization is a balance between sort of representativeness or legitimacy on the one hand and the ability to actually do some stuff on the other.
But not at the exclusion of a forum where everyone has a seat.
Absolutely. So the best organizations have, as a minimum, at least 2 different
but also
formats,
in 80 years, of course, who is powerful has changed a lot. I think that is the issue.
Absolutely. So what has happened, obviously, in the 80 years of the UN is that some countries have ended up disproportionately benefiting from the current system, and the UK is one of those countries, which is why the UK, certainly when I was ambassador to the UN at the same time as Antonio was representing his country extremely well, I must say, and one of the things we agreed on was that Brazil should be a permanent member of the Security Council, because that was the UK's position then, and still is, I hope. The UK knew then, I'm sure knows now, that we were in a very privileged position and that we had to use those privileges with extreme care. It's not coincidental that the UK has not used our veto on the Security Council since the 1980s. Because we know that if a Security Council was being set up now, it's highly unlikely that the UK would have a veto. So it's not something to be banded around. I think that has made the UK, and actually France, more responsible permanent members than the other 3. On issues like UN reform, I always thought that the best place for the UK to be was the most positive about reform of the permanent members. And that sounds ambitious. Actually, it was a very low bar, because the others don't want reform. But the UK failed over time, despite the support of many other countries like Brazil, and frankly, most members of the UN want reform. It's just that they don't want the same type of reform as each other. That's the real problem. And if there is a silver lining from the current crisis, I wonder if it will be that actually it will kickstart a much more radical reform of the UN and the multilateral system than the ones that are being discussed up until now. When I was there, I remember thinking that most things in life, it's sort of a balance. If you go too fast, you sort of fall off one side of the tightrope. If you go too slow, you fall off on the other side. You've got to get things just right, sort of the Goldilocks philosophy. But on UN reform, there isn't a too slow. It's not possible to go too slowly. You've got to go as fast as you possibly can. You've got to go as radically as you possibly can. You've got to go. You've got to really stretch, the art of the possible. And so we should just be pushing at that, in terms of the radical outcome and the speed of getting there, and use the current crisis to that effect. I just want to go back to something I just briefly touched on, which is the United States' position. So the US, as I said, is a huge beneficiary of the status quo. And if it is responsible for the end of this status quo, it will inevitably end up, I'm talking about in a few years' time now, way worse off itself than it currently is. It might think in the short term that it can get a much better deal for itself by writing that deal, but that will be incredibly short-lived, and the things that will come in the sort of medium term, the 5 to 10 year horizon, will end up, I think, demonstrably putting the US in a much less privileged position than it currently has.
Very wise words. Ambassador, Hiba mentioned that President Lula has endorsed, Brazil rather, Article 109. In fact, President Lula was the first sitting head of state to call for a reform of the Charter a couple of years ago. What is Brazil hoping to achieve with the reform? What kind of reform is Brazil pushing for? And how can you get others on side?
Yes, you are correct. I think probably as head of state, President Lula is the first one to mention Article 109 in his opening speech to the 2023 UN General Assembly. So that was the first year of his third mandate. And then as president of the G20, we established as one of the 3 priorities a look at governance issues. So, in that kind of chapter, you had United Nations, WTO, IFIs in Washington. And we were also pioneers in bringing the G20 to the United Nations. So hosting a meeting at UN headquarters open to the entire membership to discuss governance. And in that context, we tried to get a declaration, a consensus manifestation in favor of 109. And we saw that it would take a little bit more discussion, and maybe it was a little too soon to reach that objective. But what we do wish to achieve, I think it's important to clarify, is not a complete overhaul of the system. In fact, I think it's very important to have a reaffirmation and preservation of certain key elements in the current charter, in the UN Charter as it is. So on the use of force, it's fundamental that we maintain what I think many of us would consider a civilizational step forward that was achieved in 1945, which is to outrule the use of force except in self-defense or as authorized by the Security Council. So, but in order to really have that functioning, we need to look, for example, at the question of can a participant in a conflict be part of a decision? I mentioned the Article 27.3. You need to look at the composition. You need to look at working methods, and also possibly the relationship between the Security Council and the General Assembly, strengthening the role of the General Assembly whenever the Security Council is paralyzed. And in a year when we will be deciding on a future UN Secretary General, I think also strengthening the role of the Secretary General, empowering him while at the same time, maybe, or her, yes. Yeah, in fact, we do support a female, you're absolutely correct. So you see the habit. But maybe looking at a single term for UN Secretary General, which I think would not be a bad compromise, strengthening the role, but
giving
also
it more freedom so they don't have
more freedom for a single term. So that's on one hand preserving. I think there are also things to be eliminated from the UN Charter. You have the enemy state clauses. You have bodies that never met, military staff committee and things of the like. This is more like for the initiated UN specialists. So another category or basket. And finally, introduce things that were not put into the charter. You know, I mentioned our collective responsibility towards the planet. But there are also other bodies that have been functioning and that could be incorporated into the charter. I know your enthusiasm for Peace Building Commission, which I presided, and I also think has been underused. I think it deserves to be in the charter, including for something that many countries have been calling attention to, which is the intersection between peace and security and environment. I am not in favor of bringing that into the Security Council because I consider the remedies that the Security Council can provide, which are arms embargoes, sanctions, military interventions, peacekeeping operations, they will not help to deal with a climate change agenda. But in the Peace Building Commission, as you're very well aware, you have the country sitting there, which doesn't happen in Security Council. So in that sense, it's undemocratic. And you can invite multilateral financial institutions, the MDBs and others to contribute. And then they will provide some way out because, you know, financial resources is one of the key elements in improving the situation for individual countries. So I'm just giving a few ideas, but maybe the main message is that not recreating, you know, reinventing the wheel, using what we have, and introducing some change. But there was one point that we made at the 80th anniversary that I would like to highlight, you know, because some people feel, oh, this may not be the most appropriate moment. It may be dangerous to embark on a mission of this level of ambition when the international environment is so fraught. But the other argument that can be made, I think convincingly, is that it's also very dangerous not to do anything. I think it's very dangerous to sit back and observe a crumbling. The edifice itself is not crumbling. What is really creating this kind of sensation of a slippery slope towards anarchy is the behavior of states. The fact that states don't obey or don't value the edifice that has been created. So for all of us who do value it, I think we need to get together to what I call coalition of the responsible. I don't like coalition of the willing because it evokes, you know, other activity.
So just add, I think there are parts of the edifice that parts of the world would consider extremely inequitable. And I think you would agree if we look at how the system plays out and how the kind of power politics in it. So there are parts that need to be protected and that if there was greater respect for, and that's one of the things I think a revised charter could look at, how do you actually improve enforcement and accountability? But there are parts that are fundamentally unfair, and again, depending on your vantage point, you would see the system as not serving your interests.
But I would like to comment on this, on the point of this, you know, almost like self-censorship, saying, I don't know, if we reopen this, it's going to get worse. When we started the work on the reform of the peace-building architectures, I'm one of the 5 independent eminent persons to the reform of the peace-building architecture. The whole idea of strengthening the focus on prevention was seen as impossible. You know, don't mention the word prevention, you can't put the word prevention. Actually, after a year of negotiations, the resolution reflected this emphasis on prevention. It's very much encapsulated as it was in the letter that we sent to member states, and it's been made a key element of this refocusing of the Peacebuilding Commission. So, if you don't try, if you don't push, you don't get. I mean, sometimes you just need to make the case and continue. I mean, it doesn't always work.
One spin that I really like that has been introduced into the prevention debate is that you can sell prevention as sovereignty enhancing. Yeah. Countries that agree to look at prevention seriously, they're enhancing their sovereignty. Whereas previously there was this fear that prevention was an undue interference into your sovereignty.
And that's work that we did also with the Peace Building Fund Advisory Group. We organized a joint meeting with the Peace Building Commission where we actually had countries that talked about their own experience of having these discussions around prevention. Kenya, Canada, a number of countries that talked about how Sri Lanka, yes, could be useful. Matthew, let me go back to issues that are really critical in the debate here. I mean, the US is undoubtedly key to UK security, but after failing to condemn the abduction of a sitting head of state, like in the case of Venezuela, or the rather timid response that we've seen on Greenland, the threats to Greenland, what will it take for the UK to stand up to its ally, to actually, help its ally see what is creating in terms of the impacts on the geopolitics?
First of all, I don't think that the UK government has been timid on Greenland. I think Keir Starmer has stood up to President Trump.
As days went by.
And secondly, if you look at the whole range of responses that different leaders around the world have taken to the US president, I don't think you could say that the evidence points that any particular style works the whole time. So even the people who clearly have had a significantly strong relationship with him in his first year of his second term have ended up being on the wrong side of him or one of his posts recently. So you have to adapt, and I think that the UK government absolutely needs to adapt in its dealings with President Trump and make sure that that they are absolutely standing up for the British interest and doing that in ways that are as robust as the circumstances require. I mean, normally in British diplomacy, you think that you're going to get much better results if you keep your most robust words behind the scenes, and I think that will continue to be it's a sort of British trait, isn't it? And a second British trait is pragmatism, and I think this is a moment for being pragmatic, but I also hope to be bold and to be radical, and on this multilateral stuff to really think that this is crying out for individuals, but also member states, including countries like the UK, to be very positive proponents of a radical reform package. And as the previous discussion demonstrated, there are all sorts of things that we shouldn't lose from the status quo. We don't want to lose the baby with the bathwater. We don't want to say that everything about the current system is broken. And the debate about prevention is a fantastic example where the system itself has really moved. Peace building, likewise, peacekeeping, which we haven't even mentioned, but I mean, that wasn't in the UN Charter either, because that didn't exist until the 50s and 60s, and has saved countless lives. I mean, clearly at huge cost. It's not perfect by any means, but it is a contribution to the world that the UN, in particular the Security Council, has provided. And elsewhere, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the beginning of global governance on climate and other, and technology, all of that, I would count as positives that must be maintained in whatever comes next. But it is a time for the UK, I think, to step up, to use the fact that we do have much stronger relationship with the United States than most other countries do, and to use that to our advantage rather than to allow it to hinder us or our ability to say what really matters.
So should the UK engage with the idea of Article 109?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I hope that it is. Really.
Is it?
We have had, let me be diplomatic now, we have had positive and constructive discussions. No, I think it's...
You could work for the UK government.
I think it's a process that in every conversation we have with almost any country, it takes time. You go on a journey, and at first you think this is a crazy idea, and you could end up with something worse. And then slowly you see, well, actually our options are quite limited. And by the end of the 1 hour discussion, you've moved towards a bit more openness and if not full-on support. So I think we certainly, I think, have a recognition from the UK that something needs to be done right now. And what we are trying to say is, everyone agrees on the problem. We need to be propositional about putting some potential solutions on the table, and there hasn't been very much of that. And so to the extent that this is actually a concrete idea, people are engaging with it. I would just say one thing on the point of standing up to allies, and in particular to President Trump. I think what has been lacking in a lot of the response is leaning into collective power. And so a lot of countries are negotiating, whether it's on tariffs or on the response to Greenland, one-on-one with the world's biggest superpower, rather than saying, what are the fora in which we can get together as a collective, as a majority of countries, and express our collective will, and then you have power in numbers. And that's what a process like Article 109, in this case, but also more broadly, can offer, is a forum in which we start to develop a consensus among the majority of countries about a way forward, rather than everyone trying to do it in their own corner.
Just to play devil's advocate, some critics would argue that Venezuela, Gaza, a number of things we've seen would not, a different charter, a reformed charter would have not prevented them anyway. What do you counter?
If there had been, the war in Gaza began October 7th. October 8th, there was a debate in the UN Security Council. The US vetoed a humanitarian ceasefire resolution. If an agreement had been reached then for a ceasefire, 70,000 lives would have been saved. That's a very concrete example. We can talk about, can we ever get to a point in which the veto is not used? And that comes back to your point about power politics and the realities that we're going to face. But certainly the charter currently ties the hands of the UN behind its back in being able to mount an effective response in situations like this. Venezuela, what if the UN Charter had a pre-authorized automatic response mechanism in cases of major breaches of international peace and security, where the UN General Assembly could trigger automatically a response when the Charter is violated? What if it had a collective security guarantee like NATO? There are things we could imagine that would allow the UN to be a much more forceful actor in such situations. Greenland, some people would find this a fanciful idea, but a UN standing peace force, which was actually part of the original vision, whereby you have the capacity to respond in such a situation. But I think overall, we cannot prevent these kinds of breaches from happening. What we can do is enhance the capacity of the UN to respond when they do. And here we have a major problem on accountability and on enforcement. And there's scope there, I think, in a revised charter once again, where, for instance, compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice as a condition for UN membership. How is it that you can join the UN but then choose not to be bound by the UN's court? So there are a number of ways. How would we get to that? And wouldn't the powerful countries block any such changes? Of course, these things will face resistance, but as you said, you don't get anything if you don't ask. And so you've got to put the political pressure for some change, and eventually you get a little bit because you've put so much pressure, and there are many examples in history where in the first instance, a member of the P5 or multiple members will resist a change because it does threaten their interests. And over time, they find that the political price of blockage and of going against the vast majority of countries just isn't worth it for them, and they relent. So we've got to try.
And I really agree with that. And I also agree that the risk-reward calculus has changed dramatically. So hanging on to the status quo does not look anything like as attractive as it might have done before. I think you might get pushback in terms of whether reforming the UN Charter is actually going to the heart of the problem. It must be possible to more quickly than that make changes that have more impact than that. I think that. Well, I think coming together to create a updated version of what the rule of law really means, and sticking to that, as Antonio was describing, I think that's got to be absolutely be at the heart of it. I'm not convinced that the problems that the UN currently has and the multilateral system currently has all all are because of the Charter. They're because of either interpretation of the Charter or, as Antonia said, action of member states, and we should fix those things rather than the Charter. I'm not against Article 109 at all. I just think by the time we get there, so many other things would have gone wrong that we'll be running to catch up. We need some quicker wins.
And I think where we can find those quicker wins, we should absolutely take them. But there will, and if some of these ideas around a coalition of the responsible come to be, where you could define that vision of, what does the rule of law look like in the 21st century? What's our vision for the UN in the 21st century? We can indeed do that faster. At some point, it will need to come back into the legitimacy that a UN stamp of approval will provide, and be codified in some way for the long term. But yes, I think there are many steps on that journey.
And on that note of the UN stamp of approval, I want to open to the audience in 1 minute, also the audience online, so do submit questions. I'll take them from the chat. But one last question to the three of you. So the Prime Minister just down the road is currently mulling over this invitation to a special gentleman club that comes with a $1 billion membership fee. Mm-hmm. Should any country that is a supporter of multilateralism take up the special invitation, in your view?
I've given my view from the top that I think this would be a nail in the coffin of the United Nations to legitimize an alternative space for resolving peace and security that is run by someone who has appointed himself and has a track record of military intervention in foreign countries. I think that is a very, very, very dangerous precedent to set. But your president has been invited, and you're
of all the points in Trump's 20-point plan that did secure the end of the war in Gaza, this is probably the one that is sort of least relevant to Gaza as well, and sort of least credible. I think we should pay tribute to what he and his team and all the other people working with his team did to bring that ceasefire in Gaza and to begin to do the rebuilding of Gaza that does keep a prospect of final state of Palestine in sight and does bring hope back to that region. I think the border peace is now become pretty much irrelevant to Gaza, and is now, because there is other sort of architecture underneath that will be managing both the domestic and, as in Palestinian and international aspects of Gaza. So I think the border peace is separate. And if I was a permanent member of the Security Council, or indeed an aspiring permanent member of the Security Council, I would want to stick with that and make that work, not the border peace.
Yeah, of course, there are many questions, even vis-a-vis Gaza, as to the delegitimization of the UN in Gaza, but that will require a whole other conversation.
I think we would need to be certain also that a commitment to some essential tenets of international accepted behaviors, such as respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, are part of the policy of the proponent of this board. Because a country that threatens to annex its northern neighbor, to invade its southern neighbor, blockades the Caribbean Sea, is now threatening to acquire territory that belongs to a European country by force if necessary. How committed to peace is that kind of agenda? So I think these are very fundamental questions we need to ask ourselves. And if I could add something a little bit different, because I tend to agree with everything my colleagues are saying, including what Matthew said, there are many ways in which you can reform that do not necessarily require an Article 109 review conference. You can, for example, create a climate council, which is something we defend through General Assembly resolution and so on. But what I believe that this moment requires is perhaps for countries, and I say this as Ambassador Brazil accredited to a European country, a very important one, a permanent member of the Security Council, sixth largest economy in the world, is that on the part of the multilateral developed countries of the North, really looking seriously at establishing partnerships with countries in the South. I think the article by Gordon Brown today in The Guardian points in that direction. personalities like Dominique de Villepin in France. He's been saying, this is the moment for France really to reach out. We just signed a Mercosur European Union free trade agreement after 25 years of negotiation that have a commercial relevance, but I also hope it will signal a readiness for greater coordination and less mistrust or residual hesitation in really embracing common cause when it comes to saving multilateralism and plotting the way forward. Because let's face it, if any one of you who have attended a climate negotiation or debates in New York or elsewhere, this north-south dynamics is not what it should be. It's very contentious, sometimes even hostile, and there's a resistance on the part of many countries. I think the South also has to sometimes demonstrate a greater readiness to coordinate with the North. But the moment is of such danger and complexity that I think we really need to rally around common cause if we are to defeat, the unilateralists. Let's describe them that way. It can be a government today in a powerful country. It can be a government tomorrow in another powerful country. But this is really the challenge, defeating unilateralism.
And I'll just say that Macron, in turning down the invitation to join the Board of Peace, specifically said this raises serious questions about the principles of the UN Charter, which should not be called into question. So coming back to the parts of the Charter that we would want to defend.
Excellent. I already have a lot of questions online, but I think it's only fair that we start in the room. There is a roving mic. I tend to start with women. I don't see any woman wanting to ask a question, so I'd like to start with men. Women, come on. So we start with gentlemen here and then there.
Hello, good afternoon. Luis Vieira with the Bretton Woods Project. I have a question actually related to the final intervention by the Ambassador Patriota. And I understand why the discussions tend to focus on the peace and security component, but I'm very interested in your final remarks and the links between what I would call the peace development nexus. And I would like your opinions about how does the governance reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, fit into these discussions? And for the UK, for example, you're talking about the impetus for Europe to think about realigning and sending signals of partnership to the Global South. Do you see any scope for Europe to rethink its opposition to reforms of the governance institutions of the World Bank and the IMF? Thank you very much.
Just to say that we have a whole other debate on this next week, next Thursday. We have an event with Mark Mallow-Brown and Patrick Aki and others. They will be presenting the report that they've written on the Bretton Woods institutions at 80. So it's Thursday evening at 5 o'clock. Giuliano there?
Thank you very much, Giuliano Fiori, Alameda. The way order is discussed, it's very much not just a modern concept, it's a concept of the 20th century. And that's largely because it's a concept that relates to a particular moment and the emergence of US hegemony. And the United Nations, to some extent, was the product of a hegemonic situation. To paraphrase a defunct philosopher, every order is a hegemonic order. And US hegemony has been dependent on a certain material structure, not just internally, state-capital relations, but externally, a structure of trade and finance. And if US hegemony no longer exists, if there's a sort of dominance without hegemony, it's because that structure no longer sustains it. If that's the case, it's not necessarily clear that there's a material structure that could sustain a different kind of hegemony, a Chinese hegemony, for example. And there's often an assumption that there will be something else that emerges that produces a new order. Order is not the product just of moral agency. It's the product of this structure. And so my question is, if we are not in a period of interregnum between orders, but we're in a period of sustained, enduring disorder, what would be the possibility and even the purpose of UN institutions?
Okay, gentleman here, and then the lady at the back, and I'll take a couple online.
Thank you. My question is about...
Can you please introduce yourself?
My name is Dr. Hussein Mursal, and I have been, my background is working in relief and development organizations such as UN and NGOs for 4 decades, in fact. My question would be now, I see that there is a consensus, the current setup of international legal instruments are being questioned, and there are a lot of suggestions rewriting the UN rules to meet the moment, or even Gordon Brown's setting up, the new charter. But given the speed in which things have deteriorated by undermining the international legal instrument, from the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and now what's happening recently in Latin America, which not only created confusion here, but also took the priority from other parts of the world where similar atrocities were happening and nobody's talking about, African. So what I'm saying is, if you will try to reform or redo anything, there will be a period of time needed. So I'm saying, is there a time to do that before the current situation, which is spiraling down, might go back, and we might face Europe in 1930s, 35. People who lived at that time, if you told them that 1945 things will change, they wouldn't believe you. And we're talking about now 4 years, and another 4 or 5 years. So what are the likelihood that we might be doomed to, again, to restart, destroy everything, and then maybe to restart? Thank you.
There's a lady at the back, if you can pass the mic. Then I'll come back to the panel before I go to the online one.
Birgit Maasel, I work for Deutsche Welle, the German broadcaster. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned climate a few times, and I just was thinking about the COP process and the fact that there are some countries for whom COP didn't go far enough, and they have this coalition of the ambitious or something like that. So 80 countries, including European countries, that are going further. And just wondering if this climate issue, you think, could sort of crystallize also and have an influence also on the UN reform process.
Thank you very much. Let me go back to the panel, then I'll do another round. I also have a lot of questions online. Who wants to start? Maybe the last one on climate was picking up on some of the points you made, Ambassador.
Yes, well, actually, I do believe that if there's something that is different today from 1945, I mean, you could look at many other differences, including distribution of geopolitical influence and power, but it is the climate emergency, right, that didn't exist 80 years ago. And it actually could act as a unifying element in today's world. And when you attend a conference of the parties, all of us who have been present have witnessed the energy in the parallel discussions, even outside the negotiating rooms, and the kind of interest that it awakens in youth groups and civil society movements, academics, etc. So I would hope, actually, that, yes, climate does provide a vehicle for a increasing awareness of our interconnectivity. The fact that sometimes, to summarize, I say, no, there's no salvation without cooperation, because no matter how virtuous an individual country may be with, completely renewable sources of energy, no fossil fuel, etc., it will not ensure the survival of the planet on its own. So cooperation is fundamental. And one point that I've been making is that I think we need to tap into that energy to raise the awareness of the systemic tipping point that we are also confronted. There is the ecosystemic tipping point that we're all aware of. Beyond a certain temperature, human civilization may be jeopardized in the planet. But if we do not preserve multilateralism as a system for cooperation, whether it's for climate or peace and security or peace and development or everything else, we will also be facing a very, very dangerous situation, including for climate. These are interlinked topics that I think need to be approached together. I think there's so many other important questions that were asked, but let me just mention an article that Celso Morim, who is the diplomatic advisor to President Lula, is publishing in The Economist this week, which is entitled, "How Can We Live in a World Without Rules?" So he's a little bit going towards your question, about the downward spiral and the threat of anarchy that lingers behind, some of these attitudes. And I think what he points out is precisely, let's build blocks. Let's gather and coalesce among those who are interested in preserving the system. So, and he concludes with a reference to Mercosur, European Union, and the promise that this holds, but also a reference to China, because although very often in these discussions there's a tendency to kind of include China as a spoiler, and the truth is that China is managing to address its own ambitions within the existing system. It hasn't withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. It's not blocking the WTO. It's not withdrawing from WHO. Yes, it has growing influence. It has growing technology, and militarily it's also acquiring a lot of. But I think it's very important to engage with all those who, even if it's more rhetorically than in practice, attached to multilateralism. Unless we do that, I think we will be really running very, very serious risks.
If any question you want to address, but I've got loads more otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, on the climate question, we had a conversation with Cristina Figueres, who really described our work as the kind of mother of all reforms, within which you could have a number of other reforms from within the UN system feeding into it, and the reform of the COP process, which of course she's most interested in, being one example of that. So I think you could build momentum through that would lead to broader change, particularly given the power of the climate movement. And if you can mobilize that community in saying we need more effective global governance, and then bring the climate community together with the disarmament community and the peace and security humanitarian community and the civic engagement community, there's a lot of people who would have an interest in global governance reform. We just have to help draw those links. And I would say the other thing about the climate piece is it is actually a much broader normative shift, and actually the Secretary General's high-level panel on effective multilateralism, or advisory board, specifically said in calling for a charter review conference that we needed a kind of a shift in the normative framework towards one that focuses on the protection of global public goods. And that has a whole set of implications on how we think about sovereignty. Well, of course, respecting the principle of sovereignty, but knowing that now needs to be balanced with a whole set of other considerations in our interconnected world. On the timeline, we have put as, you're right, that any kind of process is probably too slow, as Matthew said. We have put a timeline as our most ambitious roadmap of how quickly a charter review process could happen, that it could begin as early as 2030 as part of the post-sustainable development goals agenda to usher in a new framework for international cooperation, knowing that before you get to that, you need to first build a majority of support, you need to introduce a resolution at the General Assembly, you need to do a preparatory process, you need to consult a wide swath of society. Do we need to move faster? Yes, I think we do. And I hope that there will be interim solutions that help us move forward. And if that timeline can be accelerated, great. I think it will really depend. We were having a dinner with ambassadors the other day, and the strong feeling was that we hadn't yet reached a depth of crisis that was felt widely enough for countries to act. And that until we got to that point, that until we got to that point, there wouldn't be enough incentive, which I found very surprising, but that the same crisis needs to be universally felt, which means we essentially wait until World War III before anyone's ready to do something. So I think we need to keep hammering that message that we can take action preventatively, but it is a little bit of that, that dynamic that I think can hold us back. On the Bretton Woods institutions, one thing that a revised look at the architecture could do is revisit the relationship between the UN and the IFIs. And I think there are many countries in the global south that would argue that actually a lot of what gets determined in these IFIs should be determined in a universal setting where every country has a seat at the table, and that maybe there's scope for that to be renegotiated. Giuliano, I find your question extremely difficult, and I think I'm just not philosophically intellectual enough to properly answer it, but if I have understood it correctly, a majority of countries support multilateralism. I wouldn't describe the UN as a reflection of the US order, even if it emerged from it. In fact, there's an excellent book by a professor called The Once and Future World Order, I think, where he talks about how many of the principles that ended up in the heart of multilateralism came from Persian civilization, came from Egyptian civilization. And yes, we can debate whether this was truly a universal document, given what I said about who was at the table when it was drafted. But I think there is ownership over the idea of multilateralism from a much broader swath of society that would continue to defend it, even in, and in fact, especially in a moment of disorder, because they will need it even more so. But if I've misunderstood, we chat afterwards.
I'll just respond to the collection of questions with three brief comments. First of all, to pick up Heba's point there and on that question, I don't see the US as pursuing a single hegemon's order. I see it almost the opposite of that. I see it precisely because there isn't a single superpower. We require a well-working multilateral system to hold that balance of power and that order, precisely because it could go multiple directions. And we're absolutely not saying at the moment that the US system is broken and we just all buy into a Chinese one. We're not saying that at all. We're saying the opposite of that. Secondly, on the US, we're talking as if the US is in free fall and is about to destroy everything that we have built up since the Second World War. There are better scenarios than that. Clearly, we should be planning for the worst case scenario, but there are significant voices in the US, significant institutions in the US who have a say in this, and as William Hague in an article today and others have been eloquently saying, there's a big responsibility on people in positions of influence in the US to use that influence to prevent some of those worst case scenarios. And finally, in terms of the institutions and the issues, I just think particularly for the people out there, for the sort of real people in the world, not people who are steeped in all this UN stuff, what matters is the issues, not the institutions. You've got to start with the problems, with the challenges, with the opportunities, the really big things, that is the geopolitics, the economy, the technology, the planet, and then work out what institutions do you need and how do they work together, not the other way around. And I think if you do that, you can then see that, of course, there's a role for the IFIs, there's a role for the UN, there's a role for not yet existing institutions to tackle those really big things. And I'd much rather do it that way around.
Very good. Let me go to the online questions. We have hundreds of colleagues online and dozens of questions. I'll just pick three, and apologies to the online audience, but yeah, there's just too many to read them all out. So the first question is from Bashar Ahmed, who is at the University of Sussex, and she was also the director of Shabaka until recently. Given that climate change, AI, and conflict patterns disproportionately impact the global south, whilst global north controls most policies, and that regional organizations like the AU and ASEAN have developed governance mechanisms that are grounded in their context. A, where are Venezuelan, Palestinian, and Sudanese civil society voices, among others, in shaping this conversation about reform? And B, should reform prioritize strengthening regional architectures and redistributing decision-making power, rather than centralizing authority in institutions that are controlled by a handful of countries? Second question is from our Director of Politics and Governance at ODI, Katrin Wajako-Dahu, and she asks, what do panelists think about the question of reparations that has surfaced as a platform for reconsidering and reconfiguring North-South relationships and UN reform and global governance? It was recently dismissed by the US leadership, but is gaining purchase in the South. And then last, I'll take the question from Lauren Phillips, Director at FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. Curious as to whether the panelists' thoughts about the reform of the broader UN system, funds, specialized agencies, and so on, in the context of changing needs and policies.
On the regions, I mean, I go back to what Antonio said at the beginning. It's sort of the end of geography. It's not the end of history. It's the end of geography. Technology means that region is, frankly, less important than it was before for trade and for most of the things that we're talking about today. So personally, I wouldn't really focus in this next wave of reform on strengthening the regional level. I would really focus on, I think, the other two ends, sort of the supranational, so the universal, the global, which is what we've been largely talking about, and then also the local. That's just in terms of getting your bang for your buck. Secondly, on reparations, I mean, I'm not an expert, but I don't think that the answer to any of the challenges that we were talking about today and tomorrow and over the next few years is about going back many, many decades and even centuries. So I'd prefer to look forward. And then thirdly, in terms of the funds and agencies, I mean, I've certainly from when I was working very closely with them in the UN and at DFID, you know, there are some absolutely fantastic parts of the UN, and frankly, there are some less fantastic parts. And most people who are much closer to it than I am know exactly which bit is in which category. And so, if and when we are able to have a significant reform package, I would hope that, and this is probably for the next Secretary General, I would hope that there was some honesty about keeping the bits that are working really well and then doing away with or starting again with some of the others. And then a final point. It's nearly 10 years ago that Antonio Guterres was appointed. I was on the Security Council at the time, and it's a big moment for the Security Council to put the recommendation to the General Assembly, and then for the General Assembly to decide on who the next Secretary General should be. The stakes couldn't be higher. 10 years ago, we thought Antonio Guterres was easily the best candidate, even though he wasn't a woman, and it was high time for a woman then, because of his record and his absolute commitment to reform. And I think circumstances have conspired to prevent him from becoming the really big reformer that the UN needed. And this time round, I really hope that the Security Council and General Assembly find and back the candidate who is the most able to deliver the most radical reform.
And if I may, in order for them to be able to do so, we need reform of the system, because the system also blocks the GA from being able to pick the best candidate. But on the questions, the civil society absolutely has to shape the future of reform. Where are they in that now? At least as far as we're concerned, the coalition is a movement that invites civil society from around the world to join, and we have organizations that are part of the network from Brazil to Cambodia to New Zealand and beyond. And so we are in kind of phase one of this process of building the buy-in for reform. And in that phase, I think we absolutely need pressure from civil society, because we aren't necessarily seeing the leadership from many countries that we may hope, and they will need a push from their citizens to take action on this. In phase two, if we succeed in having a review, input from civil society around what vision they have for the future of global governance will be essential. I think we have some work to do in helping people understand the links between effective global governance and improvement in their daily lives, so that, as you say, people outside of this bubble can relate to the importance of this issue. But our hope is really to mobilize a global movement that is very diverse and includes grassroots organizations in making this push. On the regionalization, I mean, not for me to say yes or no, but just to say that one of the motivations for a review of our global governance is that there has been a big change in the power of the nation state since 1945. It is no longer the dominant, or at least it doesn't have the same power that it had. We see private sector companies that have more power than countries. We have massive power from civil society in pushing for change, and certainly mayors and sub-regional organizations that are in the front lines of climate change, of migration, et cetera. And one of the things that a review of our systems should do is to revisit what is the role of these non-state actors in global decision-making. On reparations, I might disagree with you a little bit, Matthew, in the sense that I think for many countries, at least what we're hearing, is until we address the grievances of the past, it is very difficult to look to the future. And they will need to see an intention of a more equitable system if we are ever to have universal ownership over the United Nations or any other institution that will follow it. And we often hear, in fact, from donors or from Western countries, frustration that other parts of the world are not picking up not paying their fair share or contributing. And that is, I think, because of a feeling of a lack of ownership. And so it's in everyone's interest that a new system that is more equitable emerges. And that, I think, can be some form of reparations, even if it's not the traditional financial reparations that many speak of. And then on the UN funds, I think we need to start with what is our vision of the United Nations role in the 21st century. We are starting with which funds do we merge and how do we save money without having an idea of where we're going. And that's a very difficult way to set strategy. Whereas if you start by saying, let's have a conversation about what kind of multilateralism we need, what role the UN plays in that, what kind of architecture supports that vision, then we can determine which funds and programs should exist and how they should be structured. But we're doing it all backwards.
100%. It's death by 1,000 cats and all these hairline cats, but there is no vision at the end.
Yeah, I just realized that we haven't mentioned the word multipolarity in this discussion. And this morning I participated in a debate where that was kind of the central topic. So to some degree that goes towards your comment and question. I think what we're observing today is actually a post-unipolar transition, but we don't know exactly towards what. So it's very unsettling to live through a transition that you don't even have maybe the terminology to describe because it's full of uncertainty. And you have pushes in different directions. I think there's an attempt to some degree to make the world unipolar again. I think it's perfectly legitimate to make your country great again or great for the first time, but it's not possible to make the world unipolar again, simply because that would imply strangling the progress and the achievements of other countries. The only way you could achieve that is through a nuclear war, and this would be like lose-lose for everybody.
But apparently on the table these days.
Well, maybe in the minds of some, but this is where I think we need to look at multipolarity as an opportunity. This is certainly the way Brazil looks at it. It does awaken anxiety in some quarters. There's a very interesting document that I often quote that was prepared for the Munich Security Conference last year called Multipolarization, and they interviewed specialists and personalities in about 10 different places. And there were countries, for example, Japan is an example where multipolarity kind of generates a lot of anxiety because they have adapted so well to the status quo. Whereas in the developing world and most of the South, multipolarity is seen as opportunity because it multiplies, the kind of potential partners for technological, economic, industrial development or agricultural development for that. So I believe that there is, I often feel that you need utopias to organize your policy. Not that the utopias will necessarily come true, but if you don't create your own utopia, you are sometimes forced to acquiesce, agree or disagree with somebody else's utopia. So one utopia that I find a country such as my own could create is a post-hegemonic multipolarity. This is not going to come about by miracle, and we know that power politics will remain with us. But it's not impossible to conceive of comparatively enlightened poles in a new world order that will commit to rules that are applicable to everybody. I think if you look at, for example, the climate agenda, it forces nations to act to some degree responsibly. So it could be a vehicle towards that. And something that came out of our discussion on Saturday also on the 80th anniversary of the First General Assembly was this intergenerational responsibility that I think the current leadership has to develop, and climate helps to develop. But it's the responsibility also has to be present when it comes to peace and security, because nuclear war, inflated military budgets are not going to allow us to have, future generations that will have improved livelihoods. So I think we owe it to the younger generation and to those who come after us to really prepare the ground for something that is an improvement over what we have. And it's not destroying notions of sovereignty, territorial integrity, respect for international law as it stands, that we will get there.
Well, on the point of multipolarity, I interviewed the Prime Minister of Tonga last night for our podcast that is released on Thursday, and he was making exactly that point, and very strongly, you know, how critical to the resilience of Tonga it is to be working closely both with China and the US. And, you know, he was saying, I really hope that this can be seen as a positive. You know, we need both.
Can't we all just get along?
Yeah, we all just like, oh, absolutely. But it was a great interview. I encourage you to listen to the podcast on Thursday. Well, we are at time. Sorry I can't take more questions from the audience here, but, you know, I hope you can stay for some refreshments, and then you can talk directly to our speakers. But this was fantastic and incredibly timely conversations. My key takeaways are really how urgent the conversation is. You know, I think you've all said it very clearly. For all the sort of arguments about being prudent, no reopening, the questions around the charter is not the moment. Actually, it's very clear that this is the moment to push for a charter that restores some legitimacy and, you know, some teeth, I think, to the institutions that are supposed to help guarantee our peace and security. You said very clearly, you know, 80 years ago there were 51 countries. Today there are 193. The Charter needs to represent, you know, the reality of today, and needs to be able, you know, to ensure that there are processes in which everyone, you know, can see that they can contribute to better decision making. It's also very clear from everything I've heard today that, you know, to achieve that, even if it takes 3-4 years to get to it, we need to build a bigger constituency. You talked about mobilizing a global movement. You talked about creating this coalition of the responsible. I think this is the moment in which it's important, you know, to come together to ensure that those of us who are strong multilateralists, who believe that, you know, we can sort of have institutions that, you know, can help guarantee peace and security for all, are reinforced, supported, and taken forward. Please join me to thank very much Matthew Rackford, Hibali, and Ambassador Antonio Patriota for being with us tonight.